If you really think about it for a minute, groups are what make pretty much everything in our world work. Collaborating with others is kind of a magic superpower, but it's also incredibly challenging to do well. And we have all experienced bad team dynamics, bad structure, bad process, where it feels more like sandpaper than smooth sailing. Well, today's guest is going to unlock the secret power of groups so we can lead and collaborate with our team to accomplish great things. Today's guest is Dr. Colin M. Fisher. Since his days as a professional jazz trumpet player, Colin has been fascinated by group dynamics. As Associate Professor of Organizations and Innovation at University College London School of Management, Colin's research has uncovered the hidden processes of helping groups and teams in situations requiring creativity, improvisation, and complex decision-making. He has written about group dynamics for both popular science and management audiences, and his work has been profiled in prominent media outlets such as BBC, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, NPR, and The Times. Now here's my conversation with Colin. Thank you so much for coming on today, Colin. I'm really excited to talk with you about the research and the work you've done on teams and why teams are so powerful, because everyone listening either is managing a team or will become a manager of a team. And so teams are really like the life of what we do and what we talk about on the show. So thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Mamie.
Can you start us off with why teams? Like, why groups? Why do we even work this way at all? Like, what's the power? What's the importance of having teams and not just all of us putting our heads down and doing our own work, which would be a lot easier sometimes, it feels like.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like we wish we weren't wired to cooperate in groups and that wasn't so much more of the superpower of humanity that it would, I think we all have heard the idea that, hell is other people, and the idea that for so many managers, the hardest part of your job is figuring out how to cooperate, how to coordinate, how to work in these groups. And that, for me, that's great. It keeps me in business. I'm in the business of helping people with groups. But they're so important because it is what set us apart as a species on some level, that our ability to go beyond what one mind, what one pair of hands could accomplish, what one family, one tribe, or people who were even alive at one time, right? Like we have the ability to collaborate across time and space and any kind of boundary that we have. And that it's hard. It's something that we have to work at because as we've kind of gone into the modern world of work, we've encountered all these things we weren't wired to do. We were wired to understand people who were right in front of us. And we were certainly wired to figure out, who's going to be a friend and who's going to be a foe. But we weren't wired to say, how do I work with somebody who doesn't think like me? How do I really get the most out of interacting with people who, maybe if we're in prehistoric times, I wouldn't have coded as being part of my tribe or my group. But now we've seen the benefits of working across these boundaries, and that we've watched, company after company, country after country benefit from collaborating with diverse groups of other people and leveraging the different kinds of expertise and knowledge that we all can bring to bear. And that's why, groups are really the only thing now that make the big scientific discoveries, that start the important new companies, that make the great new music, or, are the, making the movies or the TV or basically everything that we're consuming. So groups are behind basically everything that we value in society, but we have to work really hard to get the most out of them.
Yes, I think that is like the crux of it, is that it takes work to work with other people. It's not something that comes so naturally to everyone and so easily to all of us with all of our differences and our personalities and our approaches. You mentioned and you alluded to like the big things come from groups, and we see all these benefits. What do you see as being the real benefits that come from working well with your team or getting your team to work well together? Besides the obvious, we can get big things done. Are there other benefits that we take from working with others?
So, I mean, working with other people helps us fulfill really core human drives, right? Like there's a theory called self-determination theory that says we have three basic categories of drives that like you can't really reduce further. That we want to feel a sense of belonging, like we have other people that we relate to who care about us and our well-being. We want to feel competent, that we can get things done, that we can accomplish our goals, and that we can do what we want to do in the world. And that we also want to feel a sense of autonomy, that we control our own destinies and we aren't just the slave to somebody else's goals and desires. And you know groups are really good for the first two that I said. Groups are the vehicle by which we experience belonging. Because they're the way we get a lot of things done. They are a vehicle for us accomplishing our goals and feeling competent. But there's a tension there with our feeling of autonomy sometimes. And so we join groups because we're basically wired to do that. That there's no other way to be as a human. But we're always kind of add a little bit of tension with them, where groups are presenting this paradox of between our desire to feel like an individual who can do whatever we want and our need to fit in with this broader group of people. So groups are not just the thing that's helping us accomplish our goals, they're also the way that we feel satisfied as a human, because otherwise if we don't feel like we belong to something, we're not going to feel nearly as good as if we do.
It's so interesting to think about this as the role of a manager, right? If your role as a manager is to help your team members hit all three of those buckets, to feel like they belong, to be part of accomplishing big goals, and to feel autonomous in their ability to do their work and be part of the team. Like, wow, I'm just like, if we could just do those three things, like that would be so magical and not so easy, obviously. Especially given what you started off saying around people being so, like the people that we're working with, our teams are more diverse than ever. We're working across time and space in ways that we are new to many of us. We've not been working remotely for all that long. Mm. What are some of the things that you're seeing work effectively to help people navigate those differences around diversity, or navigate the differences around time zones and virtual teaming and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two big categories of things I think managers can do to help. One, to help us all feel this, all of our needs are achieved at work, and then also to get the most out of the fact that we do have diverse perspectives, that we do have people who are scattered all over the world, and that those two big buckets are things about the structure of the team itself, and then things that are about the actual online coaching of the team, the day-to-day, asking what's going on, helping, checking in with your team to try and help keep everyone motivated. Now, when most people think of team leadership, they often have a mental picture more in the coaching bucket, that we think of sports coaches giving a fiery halftime speech, that when we see, great bosses or great team leaders depicted in television or movies, we often see them, standing up and giving a rousing motivational speech. And that's what we think of as the job of being a manager or a team leader. But there's really good research that suggests that those things only work when we've gotten the structure of the team right in the first place. And so there's a great study of Xerox technicians. It was done by Ruth Wagaman, who's one of my collaborators and mentors. And she studied this situation where Xerox had, they had all these technicians, and they found the technology at the time was moving so quickly that the problems machines were having were almost new every single time. And so they started having technicians work in these self-managing teams so they could sort of learn from one another about the problems that they were having. And Ruth got a chance to assess the structure of these teams and actually the coaching behavior, both good and bad. So she was able to measure positive coaching that was encouraging self-management and autonomy and some of the good things we've been talking about, but also bad coaching behavior where leaders were being micromanaging, they were doing things on behalf of the team, they were intervening and in their work and taking over rather than letting the team do what it needed to do. And what she found was that teams that were well structured, that were thoughtfully composed with a diverse mix of knowledge, talents, and skills, that had clear goals, that had well-designed tasks, and had clear norms for interacting, those teams benefited from positive coaching and were generally inoculated against negative coaching. So when you had a micromanager of these well-structured teams, those teams didn't suffer very much. Whereas the reverse was true for poorly structured teams. Poorly structured teams really didn't benefit from positive coaching, but they were hurt quite a lot by negative coaching. And so when we think about what leaders can do, it's important to first focus on structure and not kind of give in to this conventional wisdom about what a team leader is supposed to do when things aren't going well and get up and give a speech. Actually, the first place to look is to the team structure. And if you've really analyzed and intervened in that structure in a positive way, you have a much better chance of being able to coach that team.
Ooh, this feels so juicy. Can you break down these different pieces of structure that you mentioned and we can think about, like, for our own teams, what do we need to put into place if we're not there yet?
Yeah, absolutely. And, if there is one thing I find when I teach about this and I talk about this with managers is that it's nobody's first instinct to go back to structure. And there's actually another great study of this where they asked participants in a lab study to look at teams that had structural problems, but they gave them a choice. Are you going to intervene in team process? Are you going to fire some people or bring some new people onto the team? Or are you going to go back and try and fix the structure? And they found over 80% of people would intervene directly in process, and only about 4% of people would intervene in structure. So it's definitely something that we all need to think about more, because it's not our natural go-to when we intervene in teams. So the first thing I talked about was the composition of the team. And this is a really big one, right? Like if you don't get people who have the right mix of knowledge and skills for the task, you're obviously going to have a lot of problems, right? Like if you got a team of people who look like me to go play basketball in the NBA, we wouldn't do very well, no matter how well coached, no matter if we get everything else right. So you have to have people that have the knowledge and skills necessary to do the task. But you'd be surprised how often that's not how teams are composed. That teams are often composed by looking at who's available. They're composed by looking at political considerations within the organization. I don't feel like I can exclude Colin from this team because then he'll be upset, so I'm going to put him on the team. So, just getting people to say, what knowledge and skills do we need to get this task done? And have I checked that we have those on the team? You're actually already ahead of a lot of teams where that wasn't the main consideration in composing them. Now, the second mistake I'd say people make is that they generally make teams too big. So most work teams have more people than they need, and that research would suggest is wise. So in the book, I talk about research that shows there actually is kind of an optimal number of people on a team. And that number is 4.5. So 4.5, unfortunately, is a really hard number of people to have on the team because it's hard to have that half person. But I say we can sort of think of it as 4 or 5 is ideal. Anywhere from 3 to 7 is okay. Depends what kind of task you're doing. But when we get bigger than around 7, if you think about being around at a meeting table and there's 6 or 7 people there, then we can still have a discussion. Like whether this is a dinner party or a work meeting, we can have one conversation where everybody's talking to everybody, and that we feel like, most people are going to feel like they have their say, they have the opportunity to get into that discussion. But once you get into 8, 9, 10 people, that's usually not how we feel. And this is where that number 4.5 comes from, is when you ask people, is your team too big or too small? The two lines cross, is my team too big and is my team too small? They cross right at 4.5. So usually that's where we feel like we're in a team that we can contribute to, that is, it's positive to be a member of such a team. So I tell this research to so many different executives and managers, and everyone kind of nods along, but also people kind of hate this research because a lot of people are in teams that are bigger than this, and they don't feel like there's a way for them to get down to this more functional number. So, and this ties into the idea of having good tasks for teams. If you have what you would consider your team to be of 15, 20 people, you're kind of managing a small organization already. And so what you want to do in that situation is say, can I get identifiable tasks that I can ask subsets of people to do? Can I have task forces? Can I have committees? Can I have smaller groups of people that fit this 3 to 7 people description doing actual pieces of work? But if you're saying, oh, I've got a project and I've got 20 people and all 20 people are doing this one project, and you're not breaking it up any more than that, you're going to have a lot of problems. And so, thinking about what is a task that's going to be identifiable, that I can say at the end of this group of people are going to be able to point it out and say, hey, I did that. I can see my labor in this end product. It's got enough meat and sort of variety of skills necessary that it makes sense for a group to do it. And so that's this sort of idea of having well-designed, enriched tasks, which are a crucial part of having effective teams. That if we give people really boring work, it's going to be really hard for them to work as a team on this really boring, repetitive work, because that's not really what teams are good for. So I should back up and say one more thing about composition, there's a story I love, again, from Ruth Wagaman and colleagues' research on senior leadership teams. So they were doing a study where they were looking at top management teams, and they asked top management teams, there were like 111 of these top management teams in the study, and they asked them a really simple question. How many people are on your team? Now, only 7% of top management teams did all members give the same answer. 93% of top management teams disagreed about how many people were on the team. So when you think about this, when we think about composition, another really key element is, have we set a clear boundary around who we are? And if you think about what collaboration is, if you don't know who you're supposed to be working with, it's no wonder we're not going to coordinate well and collaborate well. So setting these kinds of clear boundaries to make sure if you have a team or you have a task force, that you're putting people's names on the email, that you're not CCing 20 people who aren't on the team, that you're being very clear about what the boundaries of this team are, it's going to help that team collaborate, right? That those are the kind of basic things that we need to do. So, we've talked about composition, we've talked a bit about tasks, and then the other thing I mentioned there were goals. Now, goals, I'm sure you've had many guests talk about having clear, challenging goals that are important to people. And the reason that people in my line of work talk about this all the time is because it's important and people get it wrong. So, if I had, two top things that I would suspect, if you're telling me my team's not functioning as well as I would like it to function, one would be you've probably got too many people and you don't have the right people on the team. Two would be that your goal is not as clear as you think it is. So there's a story I can think of with where I was at the mall with my kids, and we were supposed to be buying presents for my wife's birthday. And we split up in the mall. And this is a mall in London, which is a very chaotic place. Stratford is the closest one to me if you've been to London, and they're way more crowded than any mall I've been in the US. They're very, very chaotic places. Now we had to go to different stores. And so I said, hey, let's meet in front of, a coffee shop here called Pret a Manger. And I said, let's meet back here at 2:00. So we spread out, we go. And as I'm passing by, first I realized that there's more than one Pret in this mall. So now it's like, oh, my this clear instruction doesn't seem so great. So when I get done, I have to kind of monitor both of these different locations that they could have interpreted as where to end up. And then at 2:00, I find my kids, and my son comes back and he didn't actually buy the present. It was like, well, why didn't you buy the present? Well, he's like, well, I was standing in line, but you said to meet back here at 2:00. So I got out of line, I came back and I met at 2:00. Now, what this is I think a metaphor for the way in which we think we're setting very clear goals, right? I'm saying, let's meet right back here at 2:00. But I didn't set any priorities within that. I didn't say, it's more important actually that we buy the presents. If it's 2:05, that would have been fine, right? And I didn't realize that there's more than one Pret we could have ended up in front of. And so, it's no wonder that we're going to end up at different places. So when we think about clear goals, managers would do the thing of often do what I would call telling their team to go to California. So it's like, hey, we're going to meet at the end of this project in California. Well, that's not very helpful, right? We're not going to end up in the same place if I give you a big place that's not that specific. We might end up in, hours and hours apart. So we have to set very, very precise goals for the end point that we want to end up with if we want to make sure we all coordinate. And that more often than not, if you ask people not just what's the goal, but although that we should definitely do that, but what does the end state look like? Where do we want to meet back at the end of this project? What's the world going to look like then? And that everybody's got to go around and be able to give the same answer for us to say, yeah, we've got a really clear goal. Now, the other two things about goals I would say are they need to be challenging, that if we think this is going to be really easy, we're probably not going to try very hard. So we need to have goals that are going to be challenging for the team to do. And everybody has to feel like this is going to be important for us to accomplish. So it's got to be consequential. So the goals have these three attributes of clear, challenging, and consequential are going to be much better for a team than goals that are missing any one of these three attributes. And consequential often means it's important to me because we're doing something collaboratively important for the world, or it means I understand why I'm here and why I'm important to the team and why that's necessary. So these are sort of the three of the biggest things about structure. And then the fourth thing I think we're going to probably talk about later are setting good norms for how we're going to interact. But I would say when you're launching a team, the kinds of norms that I want people to discuss are how are we going to communicate and where are we going to store information. So I have seen so many teams where they feel like a member is disengaged or not on the same page with everyone else. And it ends up being because the everyone had their WhatsApp notifications on except one person. And they were all communicating on WhatsApp and one person wasn't getting the message. That they're all on Slack all the time, but one person's not. And so knowing where we're going to have our important conversations, how we're going to communicate, where we're putting work that's done, what literally like where on the web, what suite of tools are we using, what folder are things going to be in. We need to walk away with those norms fairly well set from the beginning. And then we need to set norms that are going to promote everybody to share their opinion, to speak up, and what's called psychological safety that comes a lot out of Amy Edmondson's research on making it feel safe to discuss mistakes, to admit faults, to say, hey, we're all going to be learning together and we need to ask questions and make sure that we're all actually, sharing what we know without fear that people are going to make fun of us or put us down.
Oh my gosh, you just said so many things, and I want to point out a couple and fill in some thoughts here. So starting with composition, and I have been on so many boards where there's 20 to 25 people sitting in a board meeting, and it's very hard for me. Sometimes I sit, I don't say anything for 3 hours, and I'm like, this is painful. It's painful to be in a meeting for that long where you don't speak. And also, it feels like such a miss. So I love this idea of really thinking about who's required for this team. And then can we have people that are consultative to us, right? They're not on the team, but we know that they might have some information or some expertise that we want to be able to loop in, but they are not in the team. So being able to set those boundaries and keep the team at a manageable size for the task, and then having this kind of periphery of folks that we can tap as needed, I just think is a great way for managers to think about who's on the team and how do we make sure that we are scoping the work appropriately and then scoping the team correctly. So that's the first thing. Second thing, I love your story about goals. And I feel like it is so easy for what we have in our head to not come across in our words. And the level of nuance and detail that's needed to get truly clear on the goal and the priorities. The way that I like to write goals, I always tell folks, is you write your goal and then you write all the measures of success. How are we actually going to know if we're successful at this goal? And when you start getting into the measures of success, you realize that there's a lot more than what the goal statement is. And yet we kind of limit ourselves to saying we have an objective and we have a goal and now let's go. And it's so important to get to that level of detail. Okay, third thing, norms. Yes, so much about norms, communication norms, norms for dealing with conflict, norms for how we treat each other. All of those norms are so important. So yes, I would love to talk more about some of that. So picking back up on this norms piece here, one of the things that managers I see when I work with struggle with is that they're kind of set in their ways, right? Like a team is already going, and unless you have something drastic happen, like you leave and you become a new manager for a new team, or your team gets totally reconfigured, it's really hard to change the existing ways of working and the existing norms. But when you have a new team or kind of a new moment, you got to kind of kick things off on the right foot. First of all, what do you think of as a kickoff? What does that look like for groups? And then what do we do if we're not in a moment that's an obvious kickoff? Can we still somehow create that kickoff so that we can reset our team down the right path?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the biggest moments in a group's life is what I call the launch of the group. And so the launch is the place where we make sure we know who's on the team, we know what our goal is, and that we've discussed the key norms that we're gonna have as we do our work. Now, these things are living, breathing parts of the group as well, that the goals of a group don't have to stay the same, and they often are shifting, and we need to keep revisiting them and discussing them. The norms, especially in a new group that we set, often we don't get it perfectly right. We don't come up with the perfect ways that we should be interacting and communicating with one another, and there are things that we should revisit. So there's two mechanisms for change that I would say that groups should always take advantage of it. One of them is to schedule a midpoint check-in. So in any task, you say, all right, we had our launch. What's halfway between our first big deadline and now? And let's put a meeting on the books now for that midpoint. And that the focus of that is going to be our process, is going to be, did we get things right in our initial launch? And so groups that have these midpoint check-ins tend to be more adaptable. They tend to learn more. They tend to do better than groups that don't. And part of that is just creating the time and space to reflect and talk about what's going well and what's not going well. Now, I think you can do it more often than that, but that at a bare minimum, you have one meeting that's really dedicated to that kind of reflection. Now, the other thing we can do is what I call a relaunch. And relaunches, I think, they're good for any group at any time, but I find I most often recommend them for groups that are struggling, where people feel like there's things that are going on that they can't change. And in a relaunch, what you're trying to do is to shift the group dynamics as much as you can. You're often very much trying to explicitly change the norms in the group. And the problem with this is, just as you said, groups tend to be inertial. So once we get this pattern of interaction, that pattern's really sticky. Whoever talks the most in a group tends to keep talking the most. Whoever's the quietest in the first meeting tends to be quiet. We even sit in the same places. We tend to talk in the same order a lot of times in groups. So to break those patterns, we often need to do everything we can to change the situation. We go to a different room. We make sure we're sitting in a different configuration. Maybe somebody else facilitates the meeting than usually does. Maybe we're setting the agenda in a new way. But that when we're making this kind of purposeful change and say, like, actually, I want us to do a slightly different goal as a leader. I want us to have different norms, to be really explicit about that, but also to open it up to the group for comment. So I think we'd be better off if we think of our goal this way. What does everyone think about that? I think we should try, work, talking to each other, working, communicating in this other way. What do you guys think? And that making sure that it doesn't turn autocratic just because we're having problems, but that we have these discussions about what should our norms be? Do we understand our goals in the same ways? And that these relaunches are great opportunities for this, and that any excuse you as a leader have to say, hey, we're going to relaunch, I think is an excuse you should use, whether it's a new member, whether it's a big milestone, whether it's just a milestone on the calendar. I think these are great tools that every leader should try and take advantage of.
I totally agree. And I love this idea of a relaunch. And it makes me think about there's like 186 first starts. The number is not correct. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But there's some research done that's like people view like January 1st as a fresh start. The beginning of every month is a fresh start. The Monday of the week is a fresh start, right? Like we can actually pick any day and say, all right, guys, we need a fresh start. Like we all recognize that we're not as good as we could be. Let's collectively decide how we want to do things differently. Like that feels like you just have to say it's a fresh start and it can be a fresh start. We don't have to wait for some big thing. I also really like this idea of intentionally scheduling time up front for the kinds of check-ins and reflections on how the team is doing. Because it's so easy to feel so overwhelmed by the work and wait too long till it's like really stressful and painful to pull up and say, guys, something's got to change. Like, this isn't working for us. But if you've built that into your team's cadence, now you have moments to pause and say, what's working, what's not working, what do we want to do differently, and make that kind of ongoing, even if it's incremental improvements, part of your normal teamwork and not the thing that only happens when there's a big problem. So I think it's just a shift in how we approach and think about what our role as a manager is in terms of the way that our team works collectively. We are not just setting it up from the start, but we're actually like continually monitoring and working with our team members to elevate. I think those are just important notes. I'm wondering, with so many teams being spread across geographies and the importance of the relationship and the belonging side. And you mentioned about, if someone doesn't have their Slack on and then it starts to feel like they're disengaged. It feels like the relationship side is so important to that sense of belonging. Not just that we make space for everybody's voice, but actually that we have relationships with each other. Any thoughts on what we can do to help foster those relationships and build that trust so that people do feel a sense of belonging and they do feel safe to speak up, even when when we're telling them we want to hear from you, but they actually feel like we really do want to hear from them?
One, being explicit that people do belong is a great first step. And that what I mean by that is not just saying, hey, we all belong and I value you, but to say exactly why. And that especially when people are on a team for a reason, to make it explicit, hey, I really value your contribution to this, and here's why I asked you to be a part of this team. That can help a lot. Now, I think there's a couple of different parts in your question that, especially as we spread across the globe, as we're interacting virtually, we're not as good at continuing to think of each other as quite as human as we used to be. When we're all in person, right, there's so many cues we can use, that we perceive small body language things, that we can see things in each other's faces, that we have, even smells and other senses that just aren't available to us when we're scattered across the world. And so we have to make more of an effort to make time to see each other as human. And this comes from sort of a concept called psychological distance, which does mean literally when we're more distant from one another, we see each other more abstractly. And that abstraction leads us to treat each other more as objects, more like we're tools or instruments or objects, than like we're other people who we need to connect to and belong to. And so if we are more psychologically distant because we're in different places, because we're from different countries or have different cultures, because there's any reason that we might go like, oh, you're kind of far away from me, we need to make more time for us to get to know one another, to remind ourselves that, yes, we're all humans, and that we don't want to be treating each other like tools. I think what's tricky here, and where a misconception I talk about in the book, is trust. We need some trust in order to work together as a team. But the kind of trust that we need comes from seeing I can depend on you. And so we need to do some work to build some trust. And there's a flaw in a lot of what we usually call team building exercises that have at their core this idea that like, oh, we need to build trust before we can start working together. But that like the kind of trust that we build, by telling each other our deepest, darkest secrets, or, doing trust falls or whatever it is not actually the kind of trust that we need in teamwork. That I need to know that like, hey, when you say you're going to give me this kind of work at a certain time, it's going to be the quality that I can use, and that you're going to deliver what I need to do my part. And so the only way for teams to build this is, one, for somebody to take the leap and say, well, I'm just going to assume that I should trust you, and I'm going to act as if that's true. But that's going to work when we've got the structure right. When we have, a thoughtfully composed team, clear goals, good tasks, and good norms. And so the mistake I see a lot of managers making is going like, we have a lack of trust in this team. I'm going to directly work on that trust. And this is kind of the same problem I talked about with coaching, that can work if you have a good structure. But if you have a bad structure, that's not going to work very well. So when you say, I've got a lack of trust on this team, the first place to look is back to our structure. And then we can say, all right, now we've got this, we've clarified our goals, we've got clear norms. Now we can really start to work directly on how we can trust each other more.
Well, I feel like this is the perfect place for us to wrap up, because it takes us full circle to every manager. First thing you should do is focus on your structure. So, Colin, can you tell us the name of your book, where people can find it, how people can keep up with you, and all that jazz?
So the book is called The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups. You can find everything I'm up to at colinmfisher.com. So Colin, M as in moose, and Fisher, Fisher. My middle name is not Moose. I probably shouldn't have used that one. And that will have all the places you can get the book. You can subscribe to my newsletter and check out all the other writing and wonderful stuff that I'm up to.
Fabulous. And we should note that your book, it talks about groups of all sorts and covers so much more than what we even touched on today. So there's a lot more in there, a lot more depth and richness that people should check out.
Thanks so much, Mamie.